Hey guys, tonight we begin with a medieval bureaucrat, the most dangerous creature in history. You're standing in a damp, torchlit courtroom in the French town of Falaise, year 1386, and the defendant is a pig. Not a metaphor, not a nickname. An actual, squealing, hoofed, pink-skinned farm animal chained to a post while black-robed lawyers argue its fate. The air smells of wet straw, unwashed wool, and the faint metallic tang of fear, though you're not sure if it's coming from the pig or the humans pretending this is normal. You probably won't survive this story with your faith in medieval justice intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lean against a wooden pillar slick with centuries of fingerprints, watching the bailiff read the charges in Latin so convoluted even the pig looks confused. Malice aforethought, he intones, and the creature oinks in what the defense attorney later swears is protest. The child it allegedly mauled lies buried in the churchyard, a tragedy no one disputes. But instead of a quick butcher's knife or a shrug at farm life, the town has convened a full murder trial. Robes rustle, quills scratch parchment, and the judge, a man whose beard reaches his belt, nods gravely as if this happens every Tuesday. You half expect the pig to hire a scribe and draft an appeal, but no. It just snuffles at the floorboards for crumbs. Historians still argue whether the pig's attorney was a real lawyer or just the village drunk pressed into service because no one else wanted the gig. Either way, he stands there in ill-fitting hose, gesturing at the defendant and declaring, "My client lacks the capacity for intent." The jury, 12 somber men who probably lost a bet, exchange glances. One chews on a leak like it's popcorn. The prosecutor counters with eyewitnesses. The miller saw the pig charge with purpose. The baker heard it grunt menacingly. You stifle a yawn. The trial has already outlasted the average medieval lifespan. Outside, the crowd presses against the shutters, betting on the outcome. A bookmaker offers 2-to-1 on hanging, 3-to-1 on branding. Someone sells hot chestnuts. The smell drifts in and makes the pig twitch hopefully. You wonder if it understands the concept of capital punishment, or if it's just hoping for a snack. The judge bangs his gavel, actually a ham bone because symbolism, and the room falls silent except for the defendant's rhythmic snorting. The verdict lands like a sack of grain. Guilty. The sentence? Death by hanging, same as any human murderer. You trail the procession to the town square where the gallows loom, built extra sturdy because pigs are heavier than they look. The executioner dresses the condemned in a miniature tunic and breeches, yes, really, because medieval consistency demands that even livestock die with dignity. The crowd cheers when the trap door drops. The pig kicks, squeals once, then dangles limp. Someone in the back yells, "Justice for the child!" Another mutters, "Supper for the bailiff." You're not sure which is worse. The bishop gets wind of the spectacle and nearly chokes on his communion wine. Executing animals without church approval? That's stepping on ecclesiastical toes. He issues a decree. No more livestock trials without papal sign-off. Overnight, Europe's legal system gains a new layer of bureaucracy, because nothing says divine order like requiring a priest's signature to hang a goat. The precedent spreads faster than plague. Roosters face witchcraft charges in Switzerland, cows get fined for trespass in Germany, and somewhere a donkey is sued for defamation. You picture a courtroom full of bleeding defendants and shake your head. But let's linger in Falaise a moment longer. The pig's body is cut down, butchered on the spot, and distributed to the poor, charity with a side of irony. The child's family receives a ham hock as compensation. The judge washes his hands in a basin that still smells faintly of bacon. You wander away as the square empties, the sun setting red over thatched roofs, wondering how humanity reached peak accountability and decided everything had rights except humans. Fast forward a few decades and the animal trial fad is in full swing. In 1457, a sow and her 6 piglets are tried in Burgundy for killing a child. The mother hangs. The piglets get off with a warning because technically they're minors. You imagine the jury debating piglet intent and want to scream. In 1474, Basil burns a rooster for laying an egg. Clearly sorcery, right? The egg is smashed on the courthouse steps just in case it hatches a demon. Historians still argue whether these trials were genuine belief in animal culpability or elaborate communal catharsis. Either way, the court records are real, preserved in dusty archives like bad fan fiction. You stroll past a monastery where monks copy these judgments into illuminated manuscripts, adding tiny doodles of pigs in chains. One scribe sneaks in a marginalia of the judge wearing a pork pie hat, medieval graffiti at its finest. Outside, a farmer leads a goat to market, whispering, "Behave or it's the gallows for you." The goat chews his sleeve in reply. You laugh, but it's the nervous kind. The quirkier tidbit? Some towns kept prison uniforms for animal defendants, tiny smocks stitched by nuns who billed the court by the hour. One surviving garment, displayed in a Paris museum, still has hoof prints on the hem. You picture a seamstress measuring a squirming piglet and sigh. Mainstream fact. Animal trials peaked in the 16th century with over 150 documented cases across Europe. The last official one was in 1750, when a French dog was acquitted. Progress, I guess. Back in Falaise, the gallows are dismantled, but the story lingers. Travelers spread it across the continent, embellishing details until the pig becomes a 7-foot monster with glowing red eyes. Bards sing ballads about the sow of Falaise, and children scare each other with pig-shaped shadows. You sit by a campfire years later, listening to a minstrel strum the tale, and realize the absurdity has outlived the town itself. The law evolves. By 1500, ecclesiastical courts require a devil's advocate for animal cases. Someone paid to argue the beast might be innocent. You imagine the job interview, experience with demonic possession a plus. Salaries are terrible, but the stories are gold. One advocate famously cross-examines a cat for 3 days, asking if it purrs in Latin. The cat refuses to testify, citing the Fifth Amendment or whatever the medieval equivalent was. You wander into a tavern where lawyers debate precedent over ale. One insists pigs can't form intent. Another counters that gluttony is a mortal sin, so why not murder? The barmaid rolls her eyes and refills their cups. You slip out before the brawl starts. Outside, the moon hangs low, and somewhere a pig roots in the mud, blissfully unaware it's a legal precedent. The cultural ripple is wild. Painters depict the trial in church frescoes, tiny pig in the dock, angels weeping overhead. The church tolerates it because it reinforces the idea that all creation answers to God's law. You study one fresco and notice the pig is wearing a halo. Irony or error? Historians still argue whether the artist was drunk or devout. Centuries later, Enlightenment thinkers cite these trials as proof medieval Europe had lost its mind. Voltaire mocks them in essays. Diderot uses the pig case to argue against capital punishment entirely. You picture the pig smirking from the afterlife. Its death sparked a philosophical debate that outlasts cathedrals. But let's zoom in on the execution day again. The crowd disperses, and a little girl tugs her mother's skirt. "Mama, will the pig go to heaven?" The mother hesitates, then says, "Only if it repents." You choke on laughter. Somewhere, a theologian nods approvingly. The quirky detail no one expects. The hangman kept a ledger of animal executions, rating each by cooperation. The Falaise pig scored a 310, kicked excessively. You flip through a replica in a museum, marveling at the bureaucracy of death. Mainstream fact, the last animal trial in France was in 1741, a cow condemned for witchcraft. Progress crawls. You leave Falaise at dawn, the town bell tolling for matins. The sound echoes off stone walls still stained with yesterday's justice. A rooster crows defiantly and you flinch. Somewhere, a lawyer sharpens his quill. The Middle Ages roll on, one absurd law at a time. The pig's legacy? It teaches that when tragedy strikes, humans reach for control, even if that means putting bacon on trial. You trudge down the muddy road, boots squelching, wondering what other creatures await their day in court. Behind you, the gallows creak in the wind, empty but not forgotten. You're perched on a splintered wooden bench in the tilt yard of a Bohemian castle, late 14th century. The air thick with horse sweat, roasted hazelnuts, and the metallic tang of polished steel. The herald's trumpet blares, and knights in gleaming plate thunder past. Lances splintering against shields with cracks that echo like gunshots. Except guns haven't been invented yet, so it's just really loud wood. You clutch a tankard of watered ale, because medieval hydration is a gamble, and watch the next contestant trot into the lists. Except it's not a knight. It's a goose. A goose in full plate armor, complete with a tiny visored helmet that keeps slipping over its beak. The crowd, half amused, half horrified, erupts into laughter so loud the horses shy. You nearly choke on your drink. Somewhere in the stands, a nobleman beams like a proud father at a school play. This, you realize, is about to go exactly as well as it sounds. The goose, officially dubbed Sir Hiss of the Pond, because of course it has a title, waddles forward on a lead held by a squire who looks like he's praying for sudden death. The armor is exquisite, miniature pauldrons, a breastplate etched with tiny fleur-de-lis, even greaves that clank with every step. You squint and swear the breastplate has a tiny coat of arms, a pond with 3 reeds. The nobleman, Lord Wojtek, of somewhere unpronounceable, commissioned the set from the finest armorer in Prague. Cost, more than a village makes in a year. Purpose, to prove tournaments are getting repetitive. You mutter under your breath that repetition might be preferable to whatever this is. The herald tries to announce the goose with a straight face. Sir Hiss of the Pond, squire to Lord Wojtek, enters the lists to uphold the honor of waterfowl. The crowd roars. Someone in the back yells, "Will it joust or roast?" You wipe tears from your eyes. This is peak medieval absurdity, and you're here for it. The first tilt is scheduled against Sir Carol, a knight built like a cathedral door. He lowers his lance, visor down, and you can almost hear him praying this isn't real. The goose, meanwhile, flaps once, clank, and escapes its lead. The squire dives after it, trips on his own cape, and face plants in the sand. The goose now free charges. Not at the knight, at the horse. You watch in slow-motion horror as the armored bird rams straight into the destrier's forelegs. The horse rears, neighing like a banshee. Sir Carol sails through the air, lands with a clang that dents the ground, and the lance impales a banner reading Honor and Glory. The banner now reads, Honor and... Oof! Chaos erupts. 3 knights rush to help their fallen comrade, but the goose is on a roll, literally. It flaps across the field, armor clanking like a one-bird marching band. One squire tries to grab it. The goose bites his hand so hard he drops his sword. Another knight swings his mace and misses, hitting a post instead. The post splinters, the viewing stand tilts, and a duchess spills her wine down her velvet gown. You're laughing so hard your ribs hurt. Somewhere, a chronicler scribbles furiously, "The goose was cursed." By the time the dust settles, the goose is dead, trampled in the melee, its tiny helmet bent like a crushed tin cup. 3 knights are injured, one with a broken arm from falling off his horse, another with a goose bite that swells like a turnip. The crowd is split. Half demand the nobleman be fined, half want the goose knighted posthumously. You vote for both. The authorities react the medieval way by legislating it. A decree is issued faster than you can say, foul play. No animal shall be dressed, armed, or mounted in imitation of noble combatants. The law extends to beasts of burden, fowl, and pets of domestic origin, legal Latin for, don't give your chicken a sword. You picture the clerk writing it, muttering, I went to law school for this. The ruling is posted on every castle gate from Prague to Vienna. Violators face fines, public shaming, and worst of all, the Duke's disappointment. Historians still argue whether the goose was meant as satire or if Lord Wojtek genuinely thought it would work. Either way, the law remains on the books for decades. Future generations read it utterly confused and wonder what catastrophe could have inspired it. The answer, of course, was one very determined goose and one knight with too much free time. Proof that even in the Middle Ages, stupidity had wings. The quirky tidbit? The goose's armor survives, sort of. A mangled breastplate, no bigger than a dinner plate, is displayed in a Prague museum. The label reads, Sir Hiss, 1378. You lean in and swear there's still a feather stuck in the hinge. Mainstream fact, animal armor wasn't unheard of. War elephants wore chainmail in India. But a goose in plate is uniquely European. You linger in the tilt yard as the sun sets, the field littered with broken lances and one very flat helmet. The nobleman is dragged before the duke, who fines him enough to build a new chapel. Lord Wojciech protests. "It was meant to be funny." The duke replies, "Your humor is expensive." You snicker. Somewhere, a goose spirit honks in approval. The story spreads across Central Europe, becoming a running joke among knights who secretly envied the goose's courage. Some claim it was cursed, that the spirit of Sir Hiss haunts jousts forever, flapping invisibly over tilting fields, whispering, "You'll never be as brave as me." You picture a ghostly goose in armor and grin. Bards sing ballads about the goose of Prague, and children scare each other with goose-shaped shadows. You sit by a campfire years later, listening to a minstrel strum the tale, and realize the absurdity has outlived the castle itself. The law evolves. By 1400, the decree is expanded to include any creature not born of woman. You imagine the clerk writing it, muttering, "I went to law school for this. Salaries are terrible, but the stories are gold." One advocate famously cross-examines a cat for 3 days, asking if it purrs in Latin. The cat refuses to testify, citing the Fifth Amendment or whatever the medieval equivalent was. You wander into a tavern where knights debate precedent over ale. One insists geese can't form intent. Another counters that gluttony is a mortal sin, so why not murder? The barmaid rolls her eyes and refills their cups. You slip out before the brawl starts. Outside, the moon hangs low and somewhere a goose honks in the mud, blissfully unaware it's a legal precedent. The cultural ripple is wild. Painters depict the trial in church frescoes, tiny goose in the dock, angels weeping overhead. The church tolerates it because it reinforces the idea that all creation answers to God's law. You study one fresco and notice the goose is wearing a halo. Irony or error? Historians still argue whether the artist was drunk or devout. Centuries later, Enlightenment thinkers cite these trials as proof medieval Europe had lost its mind. Voltaire mocks them in essays. Diderot uses the goose case to argue against capital punishment entirely. You picture the goose smirking from the afterlife. Its death sparked a philosophical debate that outlasts cathedrals. But let's zoom in on the execution day again. The crowd disperses and a little girl tugs her mother's skirt. "Mama, will the goose go to heaven?" The mother hesitates, then says, "Only if it repents." You choke on laughter. Somewhere, a theologian nods approvingly. The quirky detail no one expects. The hangman kept a ledger of animal executions, rating each by cooperation. The Prague goose scored a 310, kicked excessively. You flip through a replica in a museum, marveling at the bureaucracy of death. Mainstream fact, the last animal trial in France was in 1741, a cow condemned for witchcraft. Progress crawls. You leave Prague at dawn, the town bell tolling for matins. The sound echoes off stone walls still stained with yesterday's justice. A rooster crows defiantly and you flinch. Somewhere a lawyer sharpens his quill. The Middle Ages roll on, one absurd law at a time. The goose's legacy? It teaches that when tragedy strikes, humans reach for control, even if that means putting bacon on trial. You trudge down the muddy road, boots squelching, wondering what other creatures await their day in court. Behind you, the gallows creak in the wind, empty but not forgotten. You're wedged between two sweaty peasants on a wobbly bench outside the jousting lists of a German tournament ground. 1364, the air thick with dust, horse dung, and the sour reek of fermented ambition. The sun beats down like a blacksmith's hammer, and every knight who thunders past kicks up a cloud that tastes of iron and regret. You clutch a wooden cup of ale, watered because the real stuff could strip paint, and watch Count Heinrich von Schwarzburg weave into the arena like a ship in a storm. His armor gleams, his plume droops, and his eyes are glassy enough to skate on. He's drunk. Not had a pint drunk. "I see St. Michael and he's waving drunk." The crowd murmurs, half amused, half praying he doesn't aim at them. You mutter a quick apology to whatever monk is about to become collateral damage. The herald tries to announce him with dignity. Count Heinrich von Schwarzburg, champion of, spiritual fortitude. The count belches in reply, drops his lance, thud, picks it up, drops it again, and finally levels it like a sleepy spearfisher. His opponent, Sir Otto the Sober, yes, that's his actual nickname, lowers his visor and charges. You hold your breath. Heinrich sways, shouts, "Let the glory of St. Michael guide my aim," and releases the lance early. It arcs beautifully, straight into the ribs of a praying monk who'd wandered too close to the barrier. The monk folds like a cheap tapestry, clutching his side and squeaking a prayer that sounds suspiciously like profanity. The crowd gasps, then roars with laughter. You're pretty sure history just hiccuped. The monk, Brother Anselm, local favorite for surviving everything from plague to bad stew, miraculously lives, though he spends the next month avoiding anything pointy. Heinrich, meanwhile, topples off his horse, lands face first in the sand, and snores. The Duke, watching from the royal box, turns the color of spoiled beetroot. This isn't just a scandal. It's a theological incident. The church is horrified, the crowd entertained, and the monk's abbot already drafting a strongly worded letter to the Pope. You picture the letter, "Dear Holy Father, please ban alcohol before it bans us." The Duke calls an emergency council that night in the castle's great hall, torches flickering over tapestries of sober saints. Nobles argue over flagons of, ironically, wine. One insists knights fight better lubricated. Another counters that lubricated knights fight monks. The church backs the ban, arguing a sober knight honors God. The knights reply, a sober knight loses sponsors. You imagine the debate as a drinking game and immediately regret it. By dawn, a decree is hammered out. No knight shall compete in tournament or trial of arms while under the influence of drink or fermented brew. Europe's first recorded anti-drunk driving law, except the vehicles are 600-kilogram horses and the airbags are monks. You toast the irony with your last sip of ale. Historians still argue whether the law was enforced or just performative piety. Spoiler, breathalyzers don't exist, so officials resort to sniffing helmets. One creative steward invents the three-tankard test. If the knight can't recite the Lord's Prayer without slurring, he's benched. You picture a line of knights mumbling Latin and failing spectacularly. The quirky tidbit? Some tournaments issue sobriety tokens. Wooden coins knights must trade for water. Lose your token, lose your tilt. One surviving token carved with a tiny monk is in a Munich museum. You flip it over and read the motto, in vino veritas, in arena dolor. The law spreads across the Holy Roman Empire faster than gossip. Knights protest, claiming alcohol calms the nerves and steadies the hand. You snort, steady enough to skewer clergy, apparently. Enforcement is tricky. Jousting officials aren't exactly scientific. The best they can do is watch for swaying or sudden hymns to St. Michael. One official famously disqualifies a knight for smelling like a brewery and singing like a tavern. The knight appeals, arguing his horse was the drunk one. The appeal is denied. The horse is fined a bale of hay. You linger in the lists the morning after, the sand still stained with monk blood and dignity. Heinrich is dragged before the Duke, who finds him enough to rebuild the monastery wall twice. The Count protests, "I fought better spiritually fortified." The Duke replies, "Your spirit impaled Brother Anselm." You snicker. Somewhere a goose honks in solidarity. Remember that armored chaos? Same energy, different species. The cultural ripple is wild. Chroniclers write ballads about the drunken lance, and children scare each other with monk-shaped shadows. You sit by a campfire years later, listening to a minstrel strum the tale, and realize the absurdity has outlived the castle itself. Painters depict the scene in church frescoes. Tiny monk mid-flight, angels face-palming overhead. The church tolerates it because it reinforces sobriety as divine. You study one fresco and notice the monk is wearing a halo. Irony or error? Historians still argue whether the artist was drunk or devout. Centuries later, Enlightenment thinkers cite the drunk joust ban as proof medieval Europe occasionally made sense. Voltaire mocks it in essays. Diderot uses the monk case to argue for temperance. You picture the monk smirking from the afterlife? His near-death sparked a law that outlasts cathedrals. But let's zoom in on the tournament again. The crowd disperses, and a little boy tugs his father's sleeve. "Papa, will the Count go to heaven?" The father hesitates, then says, "Only if he repents." You choke on laughter. Somewhere a theologian nods approvingly. The quirky detail no one expects. The monk kept a ledger of miraculous survivals, rating each by divine intervention. The joust incident scored a 710, lance deflected by prayer. You flip through a replica in a monastery archive, marveling at the bureaucracy of miracles. Mainstream fact: the anti-drunk jousting law remained in force until the 16th century, when gunpowder made lances obsolete anyway. You leave the lists at dawn, the town bell tolling for matins. The sound echoes off stone walls still stained with yesterday's justice. A rooster crows defiantly and you flinch. Somewhere a knight sharpens his sobriety. The Middle Ages roll on, one absurd law at a time. The monk's legacy? It teaches that when tragedy strikes, humans reach for control, even if that means banning fun. You trudge down the muddy road, boots squelching, wondering what other knights await their day in sobriety court. Behind you, the lists creak in the wind, empty but not forgotten. You're elbow deep in the steamy chaos of a 14th century London bakery, flour drifting like snow and the air thick with yeast, sweat, and the faint panic of a man who just realized his loaf looks suspiciously like treason. The baker, let's call him Thomas, because every second medieval Englishman is named Thomas, pulls a perfect golden round from the oven, its top scored with a decorative ring that catches the light like a crown. He beams, proud of his artistry. You lean over his shoulder and whisper, "Mate, that's the king's headwear in bread form." He laughs, then freezes as the door bursts open and a royal sergeant marches in, nose twitching like he's smelled sedition instead of sourdough. The sergeant seizes the loaf, holds it aloft, and declares, "Treason by pastry!" You back slowly toward the flour sacks, because nobody wants to be Exhibit B in a carb-based inquest. Thomas is dragged to the Guildhall faster than dough rises. The magistrate, a man whose wig looks baked at high heat, squints at the evidence. The ring around the loaf? Clearly the royal circlet. The dimple in the center? The king's nose, obviously. Witnesses swear blind. One customer joked it was fit for His Majesty's table. Another claimed it mocked the crown's authority. You picture the customer now hiding under his own table. Thomas protests, "It's just a pretty loaf." The prosecutor counters, "Pretty enough to start a rebellion." The jury, 12 bakers who suddenly regret breakfast, convict in record time. Sentence, heavy fine, public stocks with the offending loaf hung around his neck like a millstone necklace. You wince. That's one way to go stale. The stocks are set up in Cheapside at noon, prime shopping hours. Thomas stands there, bread necklace slowly crumbling onto his tunic, while passers-by pelt him with insults and the occasional rotten apple. A child asks if he's the king of crumbs. You slip him a sympathetic oatcake. Parliament, not content with public carb shaming, issues a new regulation. No loaf shall bear royal or sacred resemblance in shape or design. Bake all you want, but don't get artistic. Creativity is now a crime. You picture the clerk writing it, muttering, "I studied law for this." The law is posted in every bakery from London to York. Violators face fines, confiscation, and worst of all, the king's disappointment. Historians still argue whether the loaf was deliberate satire or just a baker with too much time and not enough self-preservation. Either way, the law remains on the books for decades. Future generations read it utterly confused and wonder what catastrophe could have inspired it. The answer, of course, was one overly decorative ring and one king with thin skin. Proof that even in the Middle Ages, food could be political. The quirky tidbit. Some bakers start baking safe loaves, square, boring, and stamped with the guild mark like edible passports. One surviving mold, displayed in the Museum of London, reads, "Not a crown." You flip it over and swear there's a tiny middle finger etched on the bottom. Mainstream fact. The assize of bread and ale, enacted in 1266, already regulated weight and price. The shape ban was the 14th century update nobody asked for. You linger in Cheapside as the sun sets, the stocks empty but the crumbs still swirling in the wind. Thomas is released at dusk, fined enough to buy a small manor or a lifetime supply of plain rolls. He mutters, "Next time I bake bricks." You snicker. Somewhere a pig oinks in solidarity. Remember that trial? Same energy, different menu. The story spreads across England, becoming a running joke among bakers who secretly envy Thomas's flair. Some claim the loaf was cursed, that the spirit of the royal bread haunts ovens forever, whispering, "You'll never be as crusty as me." You picture a ghostly baguette and grin. Bards sing ballads about the treasonous loaf, and children scare each other with crown-shaped shadows. You sit by a hearth years later, listening to a baker's wife retell the tale, and realize the absurdity has outlived the bakery itself. The law evolves. By 1400, the decree is expanded to include any comestible resembling divine or royal iconography. You imagine the clerk writing it, sighing. No holy hot cross buns either. Enforcement is tricky. Bread inspectors, yes, really. Patrol markets, squinting at suspicious scones. One inspector famously confiscates a pie for looking like the Pope's hat. The pie appeals. The crust is acquitted. You wander into a tavern where bakers debate precedent over ale. One insists rings are just decorative. Another counters that symbolism is a mortal sin, so why not treason? The barmaid rolls her eyes and refills their cups. You slip out before the food fight starts. Outside, the moon hangs low, and somewhere a loaf cools on a windowsill, blissfully unaware it's a legal precedent. The cultural ripple is wild. Painters depict the trial in Guildhall frescoes. Tiny baker in the dock, angels face-palming overhead. The church tolerates it because it reinforces royal divinity. You study one fresco and notice the loaf is wearing a halo. Irony or error? Historians still argue whether the artist was hungry or heretical. Centuries later, Enlightenment thinkers cite the bread ban as proof medieval Europe feared its own lunch. Voltaire mocks it in essays. Diderot uses the loaf case to argue against symbolic tyranny. You picture the loaf smirking from the afterlife. Its conviction sparked a debate that outlasts cathedrals. But let's zoom in on the stocks again. The crowd disperses, and a little girl tugs her mother's skirt. "Mama, will the baker go to heaven?" The mother hesitates, then says, "Only if he repents." You choke on laughter. Somewhere, a theologian nods approvingly, the quirky detail no one expects. The stocks kept a ledger of bread offenses, rating each by resemblance. The crown loaf scored a 9/10, striking likeness. You flip through a replica in the Guildhall archives, marveling at the bureaucracy of baking. Mainstream fact, the shape ban was quietly repealed in the 17th century when round loaves made a comeback, without crowns. You leave Cheapside at dawn, the city bell tolling for prime. The sound echoes off stone walls still dusted with yesterday's flour. A baker kneads defiantly, and you flinch. Somewhere, a lawyer sharpens his quill. The Middle Ages roll on, one absurd law at a time. The loaf's legacy? It teaches that when power feels mocked, it reaches for control, even if that means regulating rye. You trudge down the cobbled street, boots crunching crumbs, wondering what other foods await their day in court. Behind you, the stocks creak in the wind, empty but not forgotten. You're crouched in the shadowed cloister of a 14th century Benedictine abbey in northern Italy. Moonlight slicing through the arches like silver blades, and the only sound is the soft shuffle of sandals on stone, until a single lute string twangs. Then another. Then a drum the size of a communion plate. You press yourself against a pillar as a dozen monks, hoods thrown back, launch into a hymn that starts holy and veers hard into tavern territory. The melody is Gregorian chant meets maiden fair and faithless, complete with harmonies that would make a sailor blush. One monk winks at another mid-verse. A third sneaks a tambourine from under his habit like it's contraband communion wine. You bite your fist to keep from laughing. Somewhere, Saint Benedict is rolling in his grave so hard the earth trembles. The ringleader, Brother Giacomo, suspected wine enthusiast, strums the lute with the confidence of a man who's already confessed tomorrow's sins. The others sway, voices rising in perfect polyphony that somehow still sounds like a love ballad. You catch lyrics about St. Cecilia's eyes and realize they've remixed a saint into a pickup line. Pilgrims in the guest house next door start tapping feet. On request, an encore. The abbot, roused from his prayers by what he thinks is a demonic jam session, bursts into the cloister in his nightshirt, candle held high. The tambourine freezes mid-shake. Giacomo hides the lute behind his back like a child caught with honey. The abbot's face cycles through red, purple, and apoplectic white. You slip behind a column, whispering, "This is how schisms start." By morning, the entire abbey is on lockdown. The abbot summons the choir to the chapter house, delivers a sermon on temptation that lasts 3 hours and includes diagrams. Yes, diagrams of Satan's dance moves. He ends with a thunderclap. No singing or musical performance shall occur after the hour of sunset. The world's first medieval noise complaint, carved into the monastery rulebook with a quill still dripping indignation. You picture the scribe adding a marginal doodle of a tambourine with devil horns. The monks are furious. They argue music brings them closer to God. The abbot counters that God prefers silence after 9 p.m. and definitely no tambourines. You side with the monks. Even heaven could use a beat. Historians still argue whether the ban was about piety or the abbot's insomnia. Either way, it spreads faster than Gregorian chant on a good day. Neighboring abbeys copy the rule, citing disruptive nocturnal chanting. Word reaches Rome. A cardinal quips, "If monks must sing, let it be soberly, not seductively." You imagine the papal choir practicing in whispers. The quirky tidbit? One monastery installs a silence bell that rings at sunset. Except the bell ringer falls asleep and rings it at midnight, waking everyone anyway. A surviving bell rope in Siena still has teeth marks from frustrated monks. You linger in the cloister at dusk. The new rule freshly painted on the wall, post vesperas. Tacete, the monks file past, heads bowed, but you catch Giacomo humming under his breath. That night, someone whistles the forbidden tune from the wine cellar. Punishment, fasting. In monastic terms, that's eternity without cheese. You sneak a wheel of pecorino to the culprits and earn a lifetime of secret serenades. The cultural ripple is wild. The ban accidentally births early polyphony. The very harmonies the abbot hated become the foundation of Renaissance choral music. You picture Palestrina owing his career to rebellious monks and their tambourines. Painters depict the scene in monastery frescoes. Tiny monks, mid-jam, angels face-palming overhead. The church tolerates it because it reinforces discipline. You study one fresco and notice the tambourine is wearing a halo. Irony or error? Historians still argue whether the artist was tone-deaf or heretical. Centuries later, Enlightenment thinkers cite the singing ban as proof medieval Europe feared joy. Voltaire mocks it in essays. Diderot uses the tambourine case to argue for artistic freedom. You picture the monks smirking from the afterlife. Their rebellion sparked a musical revolution that outlasts abbeys. But let's zoom in on the chapter house again. The monks disperse, and a novice tugs the abbot's sleeve. "Father, will the lute go to heaven?" The abbot hesitates, then says, "Only if it repents." You choke on laughter. Somewhere, a theologian nods approvingly. The quirky detail no one expects. The abbey kept a ledger of musical infractions, rating each by decibels. The tambourine incident scored a 9/10, earth-shaking. You flip through a replica in the Vatican archives, marveling at the bureaucracy of beatitude. Mainstream fact. The sunset singing ban remained in force in some Italian monasteries until the 18th century, when opera finally won. You leave the abbey at dawn, the silence bell tolling for prime. The sound echoes off stone walls still vibrating with yesterday's rhythm. A monk hums defiantly and you flinch. Somewhere, a tambourine shakes in hiding. The Middle Ages roll on, one absurd law at a time. The monk's legacy. It teaches that when joy disrupts order, humans reach for control, even if that means silencing heaven's choir. You trudge down the cobbled path, boots scuffing dust, wondering what other tunes await their day in court. Behind you, the cloister falls quiet, but the lute strings still hum in the dark. You're knee-deep in the reeking muck of a 15th century English carp pond, the kind of water that smells like it's been marinating in last year's ale and this year's bad decisions. Lord Humphrey of Catterick stands at the edge in velvet, Slippers staring at his prized fish as they swim in lazy, lopsided circles. One carp rolls belly up, hiccups a bubble, and Humphrey gasps like he's witnessed the second coming, except it's the opposite. "They're drunk!" he bellows, pointing a trembling finger. "The peasants have poisoned my darlings with ale." You squint at the fish. They do look merry. One bumps into another, apologizes with a fin wave, and drifts off giggling. Okay, you're projecting, but the Lord isn't. He's already summoning the reeve, the bailiff, and half the village with the fury of a man whose pets have been roofied. The reeve arrives, pokes a carp with a stick, and nods sagely. "Uncommonly jolly, my lord." That's medieval for, "Yep, they're hammered." Humphrey demands an inquiry. The village elders are rounded up, still smelling of last night's festival. Their defense? "We were drunk, not the fish." Humphrey is unmoved. He orders a full court proceeding, because nothing says justice like a trial over tipsy trout. You trail the procession to the manor hall, where the Lord sits on a throne carved to look like a giant fish. Subtlety is not his forte. The peasants shuffle in, hungover and confused. The prosecutor, Humphrey's steward with a face like a sour pickle, presents evidence, an empty ale barrel found floating in the pond. The villagers claim it fell in by accident. Humphrey counters that accidents don't giggle. The trial lasts 3 days. Witnesses testify. The blacksmith saw bubbles with rhythm. The milkmaid heard splashes like tavern songs. You stifle laughter as a carp is brought in a bucket as Exhibit A. It belches. The jury, local. Yeomen who just want to go home. Convict the peasants of willful inebriation of aquatic life. Sentence: a hefty fine, the pond drained and refilled at peasant expense, and a new ordinance: let no man or woman pour ale, wine, or spirituous drink into waters wherein swim the creatures of the Lord. Thus is born the law of drunken fish. You picture the clerk writing it, muttering, "I studied law for this." The decree is posted on every village pump from Yorkshire to Kent. Violators face fines, public shaming, and worst of all, Lord Humphrey's disappointment. Historians still argue whether the fish were actually drunk or just sluggish from summer heat. Spoiler: a later chronicler notes they recovered fine once the pond cooled, but the law sticks. Neighboring estates adopt it to avoid carp-related emergencies in Parliament. It becomes shorthand for "don't waste alcohol on animals." Solid advice, honestly. The quirky tidbit? One manor installs a fish sobriety patrol, a boy with a net who checks the pond at dawn. A surviving payroll lists carp watcher 2 pence weekly. You imagine the job interview. Experience with inebriated wildlife a plus. You linger by the refilled pond at dusk, the new water crystal clear and the fish swimming straight lines like repentant monks. Humphrey stands vigil, cooing to his noble creatures of refined taste. A carp surfaces, burps, and he gasps, then relaxes when it's just a bubble. You snicker. Somewhere, a pig oinks in solidarity. Remember that trial? Same energy, different species. The cultural ripple is wild. Chroniclers write ballads about the tipsy carp, and children scare each other with fish-shaped shadows. You sit by a hearth years later, listening to a fisherman retell the tale, and realize the absurdity has outlived the manor itself. Painters depict the trial in manor frescoes. Tiny peasants in the dock, fish wearing halos overhead. The church tolerates it because it reinforces stewardship of God's creatures. You study one fresco and notice a carp holding a tiny tankard. Irony or error? Historians still argue whether the artist was thirsty or heretical. Centuries later, Enlightenment thinkers cite the fish law as proof medieval Europe over-legislated lunch. Voltaire mocks it in essays. Diderot uses the carp case to argue against petty tyranny. You picture the fish smirking from the afterlife. Their drunkenness sparked a law that outlasts moats. But let's zoom in on the manor hall again. The peasants disperse, and a little boy tugs his father's sleeve. "Papa, will the fish go to heaven?" The father hesitates, then says, "Only if they repent." You choke on laughter. Somewhere a theologian nods approvingly. The quirky detail no one expects. The pond kept a ledger of fish moods, rating each by sobriety. The festival incident scored a 9/10, excessive jollity. You flip through a replica in the manor archives, marveling at the bureaucracy of bubbles. Mainstream fact: anti-alcohol in waters laws lingered in local bylaws until the 19th century, when temperance movements gave them new life. You leave the manor at dawn, the pond bell tolling for prime. The sound echoes off stone walls still rippling with yesterday's justice. A carp leaps defiantly, and you flinch. Somewhere, a lawyer sharpens his quill. The Middle Ages roll on, one absurd law at a time. The carp's legacy? It teaches that when nobility feels mocked, it reaches for control, even if that means legislating fish sobriety. You trudge down the gravel path, boots squelching, wondering what other pets await their day in court. Behind you, the pond glistens, sober, but not forgotten. The chains of autumn's bell become a pilgrimage in themselves. By 1330, travelers detour through the town just to lay hands on the iron links and whisper prayers for safe journeys. Because if a 3-ton bell can break free, what chance does a mule have? A local guild of ironmongers forms the Brotherhood of the Unyielding Link, complete with robes the color of rust and a secret handshake that involves clanking 2 fingers together. You watch their initiation ceremony from behind a cart. A novice swears an oath to bind all that would flee, then kisses the chain. The bell, high in its rebuilt tower, gives a single, mournful toll that sounds suspiciously like a sigh. The mayor, sensing profit, commissions a second sign. Touch the chain. 2 pence for absolution from runaway sins. A monk protests that absolution is free. The mayor counters that convenience has a price. You drop a coin in the box and feel the cold iron bite your palm. It's heavier than guilt. A child nearby asks if the bell dreams of rolling again. The monk mutters, "Only in hell?" You're not sure if he means the bell or the mayor. Word spreads to England. In 1342, a bell in York Minster slips its rope during a storm and crashes through the nave roof, landing, miraculously, on the high altar without killing anyone. The archbishop declares it a sign. God prefers his bells grounded. York chains its bells so tightly the ringers complain of suffocated peals. A petition circulates, "Let the bells breathe." It's ignored. You picture the petition nailed to the cathedral door next to a doodle of a bell with a noose. The quirky tidbit no one expects: some towns start bell insurance. Parishioners pay a penny a year into a fund in case their bell commits flight. One surviving policy, found in a Dijon archive, lists payouts. For rolling, 40 livres. For demonic ringing, double. You laugh so hard the archivist shushes you. Mainstream fact: bell chaining becomes so universal that by 1400, unchained bells are considered heretical architecture. One Italian bishop excommunicates a village for bell libertinism. The village responds by sawing the chains off at night. The bell rings once, ding, then falls silent forever when the tower collapses. Progress. You return to autumn years later. The original bell still hangs, scarred by its adventure, its bronze pitted where melons exploded like grenades. A plaque reads, "Here rolled the bell that taught Christendom caution." Tourists rub the scars for luck. A priest sells tiny chain bracelets blessed by the bishop. You buy one. It clinks against your wrist like a tiny jailer. The cultural echo keeps ringing. In 1389, a German playwright stages The Passion of the Fugitive Bell, complete with a rolling prop that actually works, until it escapes the stage and crushes the Duke's foot. The play is banned. The prop is chained. You imagine the playwright in the stocks muttering, "Art imitates life." Centuries later, Voltaire uses the bell in a satire. A bell in chains is the perfect symbol of Europe, loud only when allowed. You nod. The metaphor still clangs. But let's linger in autumn one final dusk. The Brotherhood parades with lanterns shaped like miniature bells. They chant a hymn you half recognize until the refrain, "Bind the sound, bind the soul." A child releases a paper lantern. It rises, catches the tower, and bursts into flame. The great bell gives a single unauthorized boom that shakes the square. The brotherhood freezes. The priest crosses himself. You smile, because for one heartbeat the bell was free again. The legacy? It teaches that humans will chain anything, bronze, bread, priests, fish, if it threatens the illusion of control. You leave autumn under a sky bruised with storm clouds, the bracelet clinking like a warning. Behind you, the bell hangs in its iron embrace, ringing only on schedule, dreaming in dong minor. You're crammed shoulder to shoulder in a dusty field outside a 12th century Castilian town, the sun a hammer on your skull, the air thick with dust, horse sweat, and the metallic tang of pride about to get bruised. Two men face off in the makeshift arena. One is a knight in full mail, lance gleaming like a promise of pain. The other is Father Rodrigo Davar, local priest, in a robe so white it hurts to look at, clutching a sword that still has candle wax on the hilt. The crowd, half pilgrims, half peasants, all drunk on spectacle, roars. You clutch a crust of bread like it's a ticket. The debate that started this? Whether St. Michael could beat a mortal warrior in single combat. It began in a pub, ended with, "May God strike you down, or I will." Now it's trial by combat, and the priest is swinging for heaven. You whisper a quick prayer that nobody asks you to referee. The herald tries to keep a straight face. Father Rodrigo Davar, servant of God, versus Sir Gonzalo, defender of ego. The knight snorts. Father Rodrigo blesses himself with the sword hand, history's most confident flex, and charges. You expect a quick skewering. Instead, the priest ducks. Parries with the flat of the blade, because clergy aren't supposed to spill blood, technically, and disarms the knight with a lucky twist that sends the lance spinning into a haystack. The crowd erupts. Sir Gonzalo stares at his empty gauntlet like it betrayed him. The priest raises his sword to the sky and shouts, "St. Michael approves!" You're pretty sure the archangel is face-palming in heaven. The bishop, watching from a shaded dais, nearly swallows his mitre. A priest winning combat? Unthinkable. Not sinful, embarrassing. Word races to Toledo faster than a crusader's horse. A council convenes in the cathedral, incense thick enough to choke a heretic. Bishops argue, if priests settle scores with steel, what's left for knights? One suggests excommunication. Another proposes mandatory sword confiscation at ordination. The ruling is swift. No servant of God shall henceforth bear arms, nor engage in duel, tourney, or violent sport. The medieval church's HR memo. Please stop fighting your co-workers. You picture the scribe adding a marginal doodle of a sword with a tiny halo and a frowny face. Historians still argue whether Father Rodrigo's win was divine intervention or the knight's hangover. Spoiler. Chroniclers hint Sir Gonzalo had fortified his courage with monastery ale. The quirky tidbit? Some monasteries start locking the armory during theological debates. One surviving key, displayed in Toledo's Cathedral Museum, is labeled Clavis Pacus, Key of Peace. You turn it over and swear there's a dent shaped like a priest's forehead. You linger in the field at dusk, the crowd dispersing with tales taller than the cathedral spire. Father Rodrigo is quietly promoted to a desk job, copying psalms instead of cracking skulls. His sword is confiscated, reforged into a crucifix that still hangs in the church, wax stains and all. Sir Gonzalo sulks off to a monastery, muttering about clerical cheating. You snicker. Somewhere, a goose honks in solidarity. Remember that armored chaos? Same energy, different vocation. The cultural ripple is wild. Chroniclers write ballads about the priest of the lucky parry, and children scare each other with sword-wielding shadows. You sit by a hearth years later, listening to a knight retell the tale, and realize the absurdity has outlived the battlefield itself. Painters depict the duel in cathedral frescoes. Tiny priest mid-swing, angels face-palming overhead. The church tolerates it because it reinforces clerical pacifism. You study one fresco and notice the sword is wearing a halo. Irony or error? Historians still argue whether the artist was devout or just bad at hands. Centuries later, Enlightenment thinkers cite the clergy combat ban as proof medieval Europe occasionally made sense. Voltaire mocks it in essays. Diderot uses the priest case to argue for separation of sword and sacrament. You picture Father Rodrigo smirking from the afterlife. His victory sparked a law that outlasts crusades. But let's zoom in on the council again. The bishops disperse, and a novice tugs the archbishop's sleeve. "Your Grace, will the sword go to heaven?" The archbishop hesitates, then says, "Only if it repents." You choke on laughter. Somewhere, a theologian nods approvingly. The quirky detail no one expects. The cathedral kept a ledger of clerical infractions, rating each by violence. The duel scored a 9-10, excessive disarming. You flip through a replica in the Vatican archives, marveling at the bureaucracy of beatitude. Mainstream fact. The clergy arms ban was formalized at the Third Lateran Council in 1179, but Father Rodrigo's duel gave it teeth. You leave the field at dawn, the town bell tolling for prime. The sound echoes off stone walls still scarred with yesterday's justice. A rooster crows defiantly and you flinch. Somewhere a priest sharpens his quill. The Middle Ages roll on, one absurd law at a time. The priest's legacy? It teaches that when faith meets force, the church reaches for control, even if that means disarming divinity. You trudge down the dusty path, boots kicking up yesterday's pride, wondering what other vocations await their day in court. Behind you, the crucifix glints in the rising sun, silent but not forgotten. You're wedged into a torchlit corner of a 1391 Flemish tavern, the air thick with peat smoke, sour ale, and the kind of laughter that comes right before someone loses a tooth. The room is packed with weavers, dyers, and one very drunk nobleman who has just wagered his velvet doublet that he can outdance any peasant in the house. The challenge is accepted by a hulking cloth fuller named Jan, whose arms look like hams and whose grin says he's been waiting for this since baptism. The musicians, 2 fiddles and a wheezing bagpipe, strike up a reel so fast it could power a water wheel. The nobleman leaps, spins, and immediately face plants into a trestle table. Jan, meanwhile, stomps a perfect circle, arms windmilling like a siege engine, and the crowd loses its collective mind. You clutch your cup and pray the floorboards hold. Somewhere in the rafters, a rat starts clapping. The nobleman, Lord Baldwin of somewhere with too many consonants, rises, red-faced, and roars, "This is unseemly!" Peasants aping noble grace. He storms out, doublet flapping like a wounded goose. By morning, he's in the town hall demanding justice. The burgomaster, nursing a hangover and a grudge, convenes the council. Evidence. Eyewitnesses swear Jan's footwork mocked the dignity of the upper orders. Jan's defense, "I just danced." The council, stuffed with merchants who secretly hate dancing nobles, rules anyway. No person of low estate shall perform dances reserved for the nobility, on pain of fine or public humiliation. Thus is born the law of forbidden footwork. You picture the clerk writing it, muttering, "I studied law for this." The decree is nailed to every tavern door in Flanders. Let each keep to his station in rhythm as in rank. Historians still argue whether the ban was about class or just Baldwin's bruised ego. Spoiler, chroniclers note he tripped over his own spurs. The quirky tidbit? Dance inspectors, yes, really, are appointed. 2 guild masters with measuring sticks who patrol taverns, counting steps. One surviving ledger lists infractions. Suspect Galliard. Too much hip. You flip the page and find a doodle of a peasant moonwalking. You linger in the tavern at dusk. The new rule chalked above the bar. Noble steps forbidden. Jan is banned for a month. But the musicians play slower tunes now, winking at the peasants. That night, someone invents the Flemish shuffle, a dance that looks like walking but isn't. The inspectors squint, measure, and leave baffled. You toast the loophole with watery ale. The cultural ripple is wild. Within a year, Flemish shuffle spreads to Bruges, Ghent, even Paris. Nobles complain their own dances feel stale. Peasants perfect the art of almost dancing. Chroniclers write ballads about Jan the Unsteppable, and children scare each other with noble-shaped shadows. You sit by a hearth years later, listening to a weaver retell the tale, and realize the footwork has outlived the law itself. Painters depict the duel in Guildhall frescoes, tiny peasant mid-stomp, angels face-palming overhead. The church tolerates it because it reinforces social order. You study one fresco and notice Jan's boots are wearing halos. Irony or error? Historians still argue whether the artist was drunk or defiant. Centuries later, Enlightenment thinkers cite the dance ban as proof medieval Europe feared joy in the wrong shoes. Voltaire mocks it in essays. Diderot uses John's case to argue for liberty of limb. You picture Jan smirking from the afterlife. His shuffle sparked a revolution that outlasts doublets. But let's zoom in on the tavern again. The crowd disperses, and a little girl tugs her mother's skirt. "Mama, will Jan go to heaven?" The mother hesitates, then says, "Only if he repents his steps." You choke on laughter. Somewhere, a theologian nods approvingly. The quirky detail no one expects. The guild kept a ledger of dance offenses, rating each by elevation. Jan's reel scored a 9/10 excessive lift. You flip through a replica in the Ghent archives, marveling at the bureaucracy of bounce. Mainstream fact? The dance ban was quietly repealed in the 16th century. When the shuffle became the court dance, irony served with a twirl. You leave the tavern at dawn, the town bell tolling for prime. The sound echoes off stone walls, still vibrating with yesterday's rhythm. A weaver shuffles defiantly and you flinch. Somewhere, a noble sharpens his spurs. The Middle Ages roll on, one absurd law at a time. Jan's legacy? It teaches that when pride meets rhythm, power reaches for control, even if that means outlawing joy one step at a time. You trudge down the cobbled street, boots tapping a forbidden beat, wondering what other dancers await their day in court. Behind you, the tavern door swings shut, but the music still leaks out like contraband. You're perched on a splintered barrel in the stifling hold of a 1423 Genoese merchant cog, the Santa Lucia, rocking like a drunk on a tightrope while the Mediterranean tries to swallow it whole. The air is a stew of tar, vomit, and the sour panic of 30 souls who just realize their cargo is more alive than the crew. Below deck, in a pen built for goats, sits a single magnificent lion, gold fur matted with salt, eyes like Judgment Day, roaring every time the ship lurches. The captain, a man whose beard outranks him, swears the beast is cursed. It was meant for the Doge's menagerie in Venice, a gift from an Egyptian sultan to seal a spice deal. But 3 days out, the lion breaks its cage, mauls a cabin boy, just a scratch, but medieval PR is brutal, and now the crew is one bad wave from mutiny. You clutch a rosary you don't believe in and watch the captain pace, muttering about demonic cargo. Somewhere above, the lion roars again, and the mast creaks like it's answering. The Santa Lucia limps into Venice at dawn, sails in tatters, crew half mad. The Doge's harbor master boards, takes one look at the lion, now lounging on the forecastle like a furry admiral, and declares an emergency. The beast is hauled ashore in a cage reinforced with prayers and iron, while the captain is dragged before the Council of 10. Evidence: the cabin boy's bandaged arm, a torn manifest, and the lion's paw print in blood on the captain's log. Artistic, really. The captain protests, "It's a lion!" "Lion's lion!" The council, stuffed with merchants who fear bad omens more than bankruptcy, rules. No ship shall carry beasts of prey, wild or fierce, without license, cage of approved strength, and priestly blessing. Thus is born the law of maritime menageries. You picture the clerk writing it, muttering, "I studied law for this." The decree is nailed to every dock from Genoa to Constantinople. Let no fang sail without fetter. Historians still argue whether the lion was rabid or just seasick. Spoiler: Venetian records note it lived happily in the Doge's zoo for 12 years, siring cubs named after saints. The quirky tidbit? Ship Chandler starts selling lion-grade cages, oak, iron, and a tiny hatch for holy water. One surviving invoice tucked in the Venetian archives lists cage for beast of unusual wrath, 40 ducats, plus 2 for blessing. You run your finger over the wax seal and smell the salt. You linger on the Rialto at dusk. The lion now paraded through the piazza in its gilded cage, the crowd cheering like it's a saint on wheels. The captain is fined enough to buy a new ship, or a lifetime of silence. He mutters, "Next time I carry pepper," you snicker. Somewhere, a carp burps in solidarity. Remember that drunken fish pond? Same energy, different deck. The cultural ripple is wild. Within a year, Venetian lion law becomes shorthand for overkill. Genoese smugglers paint fake goat brands on tiger cages. Neapolitan captains bribe priests for bulk blessings. Chroniclers write ballads about the Lion of the Santa Lucia, and children scare each other with paw-shaped shadows. You sit by a canal years later, listening to a gondolier retell the tale, and realize the roar has outlived the ship itself. Painters depict the mauling in palace frescoes, tiny lion mid-pounce, angels face-palming overhead. The church tolerates it because it reinforces dominion over creation. You study one fresco and notice the lion is wearing a halo. Irony or error? Historians still argue whether the artist was devout or just bad at cats. Centuries later, Enlightenment thinkers cite the lion law as proof medieval Europe feared its own imports. Voltaire mocks it in Essays. Diderot uses the cage case to argue against bureaucratic claws. You picture the lion smirking from its zoo. Its voyage sparked a law that outlasts doges. But let's zoom in on the dock again. The crowd disperses, and a little boy tugs his father's sleeve. "Papa, will the lion go to heaven?" The father hesitates, then says, "Only if it repents." You choke on laughter. Somewhere, a theologian nods approvingly, the quirky detail no one expects. The harbor master kept a ledger of beast incidents, rating each by ferocity. The Santa Lucia lion scored a 9/10, excessive majesty. You flip through a replica in the state archives, marveling at the bureaucracy of bite. Mainstream fact. The maritime menagerie law was expanded in 1492 to include New World monsters, giving Columbus's parrots a brief, blessed vacation. You leave Venice at dawn, the canal bell tolling for prime. The sound echoes off stone walls still scarred with yesterday's claw marks. A parrot squawks defiantly, and you flinch. Somewhere, a captain sharpens his manifest. The Middle Ages roll on, one absurd law at a time. The lion's legacy? It teaches that when nature snarls, humans reach for cages, even if the beast just wanted a window seat. You trudge down the gangplank, boots squelching on fish guts, wondering what other cargo awaits its day in court. Behind you, the lion roars once more, caged but not forgotten.